All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Just so you know, this is being recorded as of now. My name is Jeff Hunt. I direct LabX here at the National Academy of Sciences, and in conjunction with the wonderful folks at the AAAS Center for Public Engagement, we put on this monthly-ish series called SciEngage. I think we have Alana and Stacy so far from AAAS. This month we have Joe Palca from NPR, who's going to be talking about what is now known as the NPR Scicommers. And so he's going to start off just giving a little description of the background and the history and sort of what the program is doing. But we will feel free to open it up to questions and discussions about anything and everything related to this. So with that, Joe, take it away.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me. Yeah, I thought I'd give you a little of the backstory of the NPR Scicommers and why we created it and what it's aiming to do. And I think actually I was thinking about where to start, and I think I have to start with my own graduate career. So I was a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz. I was studying human sleep physiology. I had a basement office, and I had come to the end of my fourth year of graduate school, finished gathering all the data I needed for my dissertation, but wasn't really feeling the love of research. It's hard to believe, but it was a time when there wasn't a lot of money for scientific research. That sounds familiar. And so I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I really liked the teaching part of graduate school, and I liked learning about new stuff and listening to people talk to me about what they were working on, but I didn't really have the passion to continue in this scientific arena, especially, again, because it was a pretty hard fight in sleep research anyway. There was a lot of interest in sleep medicine, and I didn't think that that was anything I wanted to get into. So sitting in my office, and I got a copy of Science magazine, and I'm leafing through it, and down at the bottom or in the middle someplace there was this group of, attractive young people sitting in front of one of those marble buildings we have here in Washington, smiling, and it said the AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellows Class of 1981. And I thought, oh, well, what's that about? So I read it, and it was about taking people out of the lab and into a science journalism venue for the summer. And I thought, that sounds like fun. I'd like to try that. And I wonder if I know anybody in the picture. I didn't look very closely because it turned out I did know somebody in the picture. And that was Erica Good, who was a graduate student with me at Santa Cruz. And just in case some of you may have run across her, she worked for the New York Times for a really long time. But then she was like me, a graduate student. We're not really sure what was going to be next for us. So anyway, I got the fellowship, and I was sent to Washington, D.C., as it happens, to be work with the science reporter at the local CBS station. And that changed my life. I mean, no question. I found what I really wanted to do, as opposed to things that I was doing, which I enjoyed and didn't do badly at, but wasn't feeling passionate about. And when I got this opportunity to do science journalism, I thought, whoa, this is great. So I finished my PhD, mostly because I felt like I should, not because I anticipated it would be all that useful. And it has, sometimes it has, but not very often. But anyway, I was almost there. I thought I could do it in one quarter. It took two, but that's okay. And then I started in earnest to look for work in science writing. Anyway, that's all by way of preamble. I've had a successful career. I worked in television for a while. Then I got unbelievably out of the blue hired by Nature to work in their Nature Washington office, and then went to Science, as I say, for a future draft pick. And then I left Science and came to NPR, and that was almost 27 years ago, which is crazy, of course. And as I tell people, I've been in the same dead-end job for 27 years because I started doing this 27 years ago, and I'm still doing it. But the reason I got interested in the Scicommers, two things. One is I like giving talks to scientists, and I particularly like giving talks to scientists who are feeling uncertain about their career paths, because I certainly did. And I like to try to emphasize the fact that you're not a failure if you decide not to pursue academic science. And it was fun for me because by the time I started giving these talks, even at Science and Nature, but even more so at NPR, people wanted to talk to me. You know, the senior scientists who I thought in many cases were making their junior colleagues feel like losers for leaving science thought I was the bee's knees and it would be great to talk to me. And they certainly weren't saying to me, what a loser, when I came and gave a speech at Stanford or MIT or Caltech or wherever. So it was satisfying to me to be able to say to others, I left academic science and I'm not a loser, and you can too, that kind of thing. So that was sort of the background a little bit. That's been going on for almost 20 years or even longer, because I feel very strongly about, I mean, I'm not telling people to get out of science. That's not where I'm at all. I'm just saying, don't buy into this, you're a failure if you don't continue on in academic science. That really pisses me off. You know, anyway, that's where I was coming from. So 2012, I got a offer to generate this new kind of reporting. I mean, I've done a lot of reporting about what's the news in science, and I'm a little jaded about science news stories in general, because I don't think that there's that much news in science, but that's another discussion we can come back to. So what I pitched to NPR and what NPR pitched to a funder was, maybe we should do stories about process of science and people of science instead of the results of science, because the results, you know, they come and go, but the people and process, they stick around. And somebody decided that was a good idea. So I did that for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, the funder said, you know, we really like what you've been doing. It's been fantastic. But we'd like you to figure out a way to try to engage a younger audience and maybe a more diverse audience than the typical NPR audience. And I thought, well, I'm not really sure how to do that. And I don't think I'm just going to, you know, suddenly become popular with high school students because I have a web page. But I did feel like I had this connection going with graduate students who felt, you know, some of the angst that I was feeling when I was a graduate student, and like to hear from someone like me about other directions for their careers. And so I thought maybe those guys would be a good base to build a group that would, initially my thought was, well, they'll help me, you know, they're always out looking around the web and finding interesting stuff. I'll just get them to tell me about it, and they can put up a byline on this Facebook page we were going to create. And then, you know, you could put on your resume, even if you didn't have any other background in journalism or science communication, you could say, work with Joe Palca at NPR, which, I mean, it couldn't hurt. Anyway, that sort of took off, and we did okay with that for a little while. And because I like acronyms, I called the early group so the initial project was called Joe's Big Idea. And so I called the people who were going to supposedly help me was Friends of Joe's Big Idea. And because I prefer acronyms to just initials, I called it the FOJOBI, which of course it isn't, but that's okay. FOJOBI was what I called it. And so we were marching along, and I was giving a talk at the university, Rochester University, and this young woman who was finishing her PhD came up to me and said, you know, you're doing it all wrong. I said, what? She said, no, it's not. Why is the media always screwing things up? Anyway, we got to talking. She's very interested in science communication, and she wound up coming here as an intern because Rochester had a BEST program, which was an externship thing where you could go to a site pretty much like the fellowship I did. So she came here and really injected a ton of life into the Fajobis. Her name was Maddie Sophia, and you know, really changed the project from something that was there to help me, which is what I was thinking to begin with, to something that was there to help them, which I think it is much more of now. And so the things that Maddie brought in, first of all, was this idea that, you know, that graduate students, well, first of all, we both had the idea that they needed support and nurturing and caring for, especially if they were interested in communication, because, you know, as I said, a lot of times that was like wasting your time instead of working in the lab. But what things we thought, well, what can we offer? And Maddie came up with a few, and one of them was this project we called Office Hours. So that was where people could pitch us stories. We thought it, I mean, I don't know, my first byline in a popular journal was a big rush for me. And I thought, well, maybe we can, we thought we could help others do that. So we invited everybody who was a member of the group to pitch a story, and we told them that we would get a professional editor to help them craft their story, and then we would also encourage 4 or 5 of their colleagues to edit, or we call them peer editors. I'm a little uncomfortable with that term, but anyway, the idea was that people who weren't writing the story but who were in the Fajobis would make comments. And the project was a success. I mean, we started getting, we hired a really good editor to help us. We had some money on the fellowship grant to do that, and I mean on the grant that was supporting me to do that. And so we had professional editing, and then after they had gone back and forth with this professional editor, it would come to me and I would look at the pieces they did. And I mean, I'm still doing it. I did it this week. And then we would send them off to a journal. Now, it happens that, again, because I've been in this field so long, I know a lot of editors, or at least I know people in the editors know me. And so I'm able to say, hey, listen, they're not going to take an article that one of the Fajobis wrote just because they like me, but they'll at least look at it. And so we're now up to 60 published Fajobis in the 3 years or so that this project, part of the program, has been going. So that's been a big hit. And the other thing that Maddie instituted with these mentor chats, where people from various aspects of the field of science communication and outreach talk for, like I'm doing to you guys, for an hour about something that might be interesting to the community. And that's been popular. We record them just as this is being recorded, so that's been interesting. And that's another project that's still ongoing. And another was these Slack channels. We have a Slack community that has special interests categories. So some of the categories are just utilitarian, like when somebody's writing an article for Scientific American, we stick it in the Scientific American channel so that people know where to find it. Some of them are a little, just here's something interesting I saw. Some of them are related to jobs that either I know about or somebody else knows about. And I don't know, I'd be interested to know. I don't know if anybody's actually gotten a job through this channel, but I know they've been informed of jobs or fellowships or other opportunities. We have a visual group that are more interested in visual communication skills, which I don't have. And we have a Spanish language group, which neither Maddie nor I understand because neither of us speak Spanish, but it's there. And so the Slack channel is doing pretty well too. So that's about it. I mean, the idea is that this is a community to let people know, oh, that was one of the other things that worked out very well. Is there were a lot of people who wanted to apply for the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship, and the question was, well, can someone tell me how to do that, or how to help me do that, or how to craft my application? And so one of the channels was, okay, I'll do that, and so they comment on people's applications. And another thing is when people go off to some big meeting, AAAS or neuroscience or something like that, they can say, hey, I'm going to this. Anybody in the community going to be there? And it's a way of meeting up. So it's a virtual community, and it's one of the only parts of, there's a variety of, helping scientists become better communicators. But I think that the Fajobis, and we've rechristened them to the NPR Scicommers, because Maddie didn't think Fajobi meant anything to anybody, which of course it doesn't as a slogan. NPR Scicommers, I'm not crazy about it, but that's what they are now. There's a way for people to form a community and hopefully to reach like-minded people who feel there's an importance to communicating science to the public. Now, what I haven't talked about, and which I don't think I'm going to be able to talk about, is whether we're having any impact on the public. We certainly are having impact on scientists and young scientists because they're joining, and we have about 1,300 people signed up now. It doesn't cost anything, and I told you everything you get for it, so it's not like there's a wealth of things that are going to come flowing in. But there's just a group of like-minded individuals, almost, I would say 95% scientists or engineers. We tried to limit it to scientists and engineers. I haven't wanted to include journalists just because there's other groups that do that. You're all welcome, I guess. It's easy enough to find us if you just Google NPR Scicommers, or even if you Google, I find Fojobi, F-O-J-B-I. Google's smart enough to know that it's now been changed to Scicommers. So that's about it. Oh, I was just going to tell you where these Fojobis have been published. I was looking, we had Scientific American, Massive, Smithsonian, Vox, Popular Science. So it's been pretty good. On one other thing that we haven't really made much use of, but I think we're going to start is, so Maddie has actually left the Fojobis, or left the Scicommers, and she's being replaced by another young graduate student, now PhD, who I met in my travels, named Burley McCoy. And we're going to try to reach out, because Maddie's new gig is doing a science podcast for NPR, and she's going to be interested in getting science story ideas for her podcast. And I figured 1,300 graduate students or young scientists have to have a few ideas that might be interesting to others. So that could be a source. And the other one that I put out a notification for, and this is just me, is I wrote a book with Flora Lichtman back in 2011 called Annoying: The Science of What Bugs Us. And for whatever reason, National Geographic decided they wanted me to do an essay updating the book. And they particularly asked, what are the annoyances that have occurred in the last decade since the book came out? Or, well, we wrote the book, I guess, a decade ago. It's been only 8 years since the book came out. And so I've been collecting ideas from people like the Fojobis about what annoys them, because I figure they'll know more about what didn't exist 10 years ago than I do. So I've been having fun with that. But that's about it. Jeff, if that's enough of an introduction, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, I think that was great. If people have questions, if you could type them into the chat box rather than everybody trying to speak at one time, I think that'll be the best way to do this. So as you're formulating those, Joe, one thing that we talked about before this was sort of your sort of ultimate vision about, what you want to come out of the Scicommers. Can you expand on that a little bit for the group here?
Yeah, I mean, my ultimate vision is, well, I mean, there is now a field of the science of science communication, and I think the only people who aren't paying any attention to that are science communicators in the media, because they're just doing what they do and they think they know everything, because I'm one of them. But I think in the end, it's just going to be important to build a community that's ready, willing, and able to combat nonsense on the internet. And not because people, not because they're going to be more rational or more believable or more something than people who believe in the flat earth, but because they're going to be people, and they're going to have families, and they're going to have friends, and they're going to build communities well beyond scientific communities that are going to be trusting of the information they give out, as opposed to the information that somebody else might have read on the internet or seen some tweet go by. I just feel that, what is it? The only way to stop someone with bad information is to give them good information. And that's not, I don't want to say that. But I do feel that in the end, we need to have a world of people who are as engaged and enthusiastic about science as I feel they should be, and are willing to trust scientists to give them accurate information about things. Now, I'm not saying at the end of the day that every scientist's ideas about the way the world should be are right or should be followed or what you need, heaven forbid. But if you're going to make a decision about cafe standards on how much car mileage should be, or whether a community should encourage or discourage gray water reclamation services, you might as well know as much about what scientists know about that. Then instead of saying, well, my Uncle Bob told me he put a system in, it didn't work very well, so I'm opposed to them. I mean, that's not a great way to make public policy. I think there's much better ways, and even if the outcome isn't what you want, you can at least say, well, we thought about it, and we used the best information, and we decided to do it this way anyway. So that's the sort of the bigger picture. Oh, and I don't know, I was thinking the other thing I shared is I'm just trying to lighten up a little bit. I mean, people who know me, I'm not serious. I'm not serious because I do things that are serious, but I do like to have fun in what I do. And so I've made a couple of videos with a guy at NPR named Barry Gordimer, who's just a genius as a puppeteer. And we're doing little videos to try to show people some of the obvious things that can be done. But, just reminding people not to use jargon, it sounds like, oh, yeah, I get that. But even there, I watch people who say that, and then 2 minutes later, they're using jargon. So it's just something they need to be reminded of. So we made a little video about that.
I just put the links to those videos in the chat for everyone to see. So a couple of questions that have come in, Joe. First, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges and opportunities in science communication at this time?
Well, I guess the challenge and opportunity are kind of related in an interesting way. So when I started as a science writer, you either had to have a broadcast tower or a printing press or a very loud megaphone or voice to reach people. And now, I mean, anybody with one of these can reach anybody in the world because the reach is unlimited and it's amazing. So that's the good news. The bad news is everybody in the world has one of these. So how do you know who to listen to and how to build an audience? And so the opportunity is there for anybody who's inclined to get into the game, and the challenge is to get people to listen. And I think, again, that yes, the world and certainly the politics of the day proceed by trends and Twitter, viral tweets and things like that. But in the end, if we're going to change society and we're going to improve science communication writ large, it's going to have to be not with a few, superstars, but with a community, a huge community of reliable, thoughtful, interesting people who are going to be willing to take a stab at communicating and not wait for somebody else to do it. Because, I mean, every news organization is struggling with how to position itself in the new domain, because as anybody has the same access to the New York Times audiences as the New York Times does. So they have to do something that distinguishes themselves and gets people to pay for it, which is sort of the problem, again, that we're facing with advertising and personal, targeted ads and things like that. They make money for somebody, and money drives all of this. I'm only in business because a foundation agreed to support NPR for me to do this. No foundation, no Joe's big idea. Member stations, sometimes NPR decides something that's so important that they have to, dig deep into their own resources, which come from member donations or unrestricted grants or things like that. But that's tricky because once you've covered the White House, the foreign correspondence, the national desk, the elections, all this other stuff, you're kind of running out of money when it comes to doing stories about, like I'm doing a story today about a sweat patch, patch that you can put on that measures the electrolytes in sweat and does so electronically and autonomously. I mean, I think that's interesting, but it's not anything that people's lives are going to depend on for sure. So it's kind of a problem. That's the opportunity and the challenge.
Yeah. Another question is that there are complaints that most professional science journalists are not actually science literate. Agree, disagree?
I think that's nonsense. most journalists are not necessarily science literate. But I hear that from time to time, and I mean, I don't know exactly what the meaning of science literate is to somebody. Does a biochemist need to know about plate tectonics? Well, yeah, of course. Do they? Not always. Science people are sometimes science literate in a very narrow sense and not in a very broad sense. My experience with science journalists, and I do make the distinction, is that many of them, most of them, are quite well informed about the areas, certainly the areas they report on, and many of them understand the scientific method. Now, there's an argument, and I've been in these arguments to say, well, I shouldn't just report on the results of a paper. I should go ahead and vet the statistics and then double check that the equipment was used properly and all that. And I'm going, wait a minute, my PhD was in sleep physiology, and I don't know nothing about quantum physics. And it's not like I'm going to be able to act as a scientific peer. So I just think the idea, that they're not literate is just they're not scientists, most of them, but that being science literate means that they can understand what a scientist says to them and have some basic knowledge of science that they can bring to their pieces. And I think they do. Now, that's not to say I was reading someplace about science journalists or journalists who write about science being swayed by press releases, and they probably are. But the argument from there was, well, we show that they're more likely to push the story in the direction the press release suggests than another direction. So they're not obviously reading the papers. And I thought that was a ridiculous leap to a conclusion. I mean, they may be correlated, but that doesn't mean they're causal. The conclusions of the press release are frequently suggested by the scientists. So it's a little churlish to blame the journalist for not doing a better job than the scientist does of characterizing his or her own work. Anyway, whatever.
All right. Any suggestions on how scientists can get involved in science communication without actually being journalists?
Yeah, I think there's, that's the whole thing. I think the suggestions are just do it. Now, what does that mean? Well, okay. Let's say that you feel that the public doesn't know enough about X. Let's call it the plight that fungus represents, or the danger funguses represent to the banana crop around the world. Well, what do you do about that? Well, first of all, you tell your friends. That's one group that you can reach out to, especially, if you can explain why bananas are particularly susceptible and why there's not a lot of variety in bananas or species that might be resistant to switch in to the banana cultivation world. And so that, there's a lot of things that people might want to know about. And they also might want to say, hey, by the way, and I haven't reported on this, so I'm just talking with one of my colleagues we were asking about this. I mean, there's a genetically modified banana in Australia that is resistant to this fungus that's devastating bananas around the world. So that's something I think people should know. All right, so, apart from just buttonholing people on the street and being weird about it, what do? Well, you begin to look at the sources of information that exists in your life and in your friend's life. So if you have a local, there's something in my neighborhood called the Northwest Current, and they may or may not be willing to take an article about banana being threatened. But anything that you can get you into being read by more than you and your mom and dad and your sister, brother, and your two best friends is a good thing. And there is so much stuff on the internet, it's true, but there's also so much need. There are so many websites that need content. And it doesn't have to, you're not going to get an article in the New York Times to get right started. But there may be other avenues, smaller avenues, local radio stations, local newspapers, interest groups on Reddit, blogs that are well read, places that that other people are going to get their information, and you think you could do a better job of communicating to that group. You could just try. And one of the things that I found is a way in the door, not necessarily being a journalist, but how to make a connection, is the world still runs on flattery. So if you read something that you think is particularly good in the media, that you particularly like, that you particularly think did do an accurate job of communicating some topic, write to the author, tell them so. And then if you have an agenda, I'd like to try writing sometime, ask. Maybe there's some thing that they're trying out that they'd like you to dip into. But I mean, it's funny, when I started in television, I had no experience. I mean, 10 weeks of trailing around after a science journalist, but that didn't teach me how to do anything. But 4 or 5 years of graduate school told me how to solve problems. And yes, I was all in. So I spent all my days and nights writing letters and thinking about how to crack in and trying to solve the problem. And I know a lot of scientists will say, well, I don't have time to do all that. Well, you can do some of that, and you can use your skills training as a scientist to begin thinking about how to solve this problem. And, the Fajobis is one way. You can join us and start seeing what other people are doing. So, yeah, I mean, you can't all walk to the front of the line and get to be a correspondent on NPR. I got lucky, but there are other ways of communicating, and I think I haven't had to look for them as hard as I may someday, I suppose, because I've been lucky enough to be hired to top. But if I were getting started and wanted to try, I'm sure I would find things.
Awesome. Thoughts about the role and importance of diversity of the voices that are heard, both on the radio and sort of diversity in STEM, and sort of how those line up?
Yeah, well, I mean, look who you're asking. I think it's I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to do something about it. I've been keeping tabs on the gender diversity of the people I interview for the last 7 years, and also the ethnic, I guess, although it's usually easier a little bit to determine someone's gender identity when you talk to them than their ethnic identity or their sexual orientation. But I think, like all of society, we're changing. The population is changing. The world is changing. And again, going back to my original idea that the best communicators are people who are communicating to a group that are well disposed to listen to what they have to say. I think if all science writers look like me and talk like me and think like me, it's going to be only a small group of the society that's going to, benefit from the kinds of things I have to say, or at least benefit as much. And I think it's important for the message to be delivered by people who look like America. So what to do? I mean, the trouble is, if you want to talk to a physicist expert in some topic, sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 phone calls to find the woman physicist or the Asian or Chicano physicist that would fill the bill, because there's many, many more senior, well-known, well-respected white guys. And it's changing. I mean, every year the Academy came out with its new members, back when I was writing about such things, and this is already 25 years ago, I would tease them in print, in Science and Nature, about how it was all a bunch of white guys. And apparently it didn't bother them too much because it still was a lot of white guys for a long time. I think it's changing. I think the Academy's getting it. But it's going to take a while for, what is it? It's like, you know, the giant meal that proceeds through the snake. Or as somebody else once said, science proceeds one funeral at a time. It's just going to take a while for the system to re-equilibrate. I think a lot of things, like a lot of times people get mad about science media coverage of something, but I think they forget that the timeline is just, it's different because it's daily. You know, they want the fix to be the next day too, but sometimes it takes a little while.
Are there ways that you've seen to be able to sort of have outlets like NPR and New York Times something amplify the work that people do on sort of a more of a ground level? Because like you're saying, it's much easier to sort of get in and say like, oh, I have this idea coming from whatever perspective I have. But if nobody's seeing it and it's not getting in front of eyeballs, then it's not going to have that impact. Is there a way, for example, like the Scicommers can sort of amplify those messages?
Yeah, I mean, yes, everything. But the one thing that doesn't help at all is to stamp your feet and complain. I just, you know, but again, people say, how do I start writing about science? And I say, start writing about science. I mean, you can write it for your own amusement. You can write it for your mother. You can write a long letter to me and see if I have a comment about it. I mean, there's a lot of ways to increase the eyeballs, but the one way that doesn't work is just to sit and bemoan. So that's sort of my feeling about that.
Cool. You mentioned some of the stuff about sort of being more, getting yourself ready for a career in writing. Do you have any suggestions on something specifically you did that made you competitive as a mass media fellow?
Oh, that I did. Not really. I mean, I think, again, I'll be careful here, but some people are diffident about their abilities. You know, I don't really have the skill to do this or that or the other thing. I mean, and it's probably in some sense it's true. You know, you people who are just applying for mass media fellowships think that they don't have any experience. But I've read a lot of applications, and the ones that appeal to me anyway are the ones who say, I've been thinking about this, and here's what I tried to do. I went to the museum, or I went to the car wash, and I started talking to people, and I said, you know, how does the detergent that you put on the car wash get rid of the dirt on the car, and why is the paint so resistant to certain things? And you know, I set up a science talk thing at the car wash. Anybody who's like saying, I got to try this, I got to try something, gets my attention. So the one that doesn't work for me is I've always wanted to do it, and then they never have any kind of effort. I mean, yes, it's nice if somebody lets you do whatever you've ever wanted to do, but sometimes you have to make it happen yourself. And so I don't think you want to be too diffident. You don't want to bowl, you know, I mean, you can't tell people you're the greatest thing ever to come down the pike, because that'll piss people off too. But don't apologize for what you haven't done. Talk a lot more about all the things you have done and would do if you could get more opportunities.
Yeah, I second that, especially when I'm looking for candidates. Don't tell me that you really like it, but show me that you've actually done it as well.
Yeah, we say show, don't tell in my business.
Yeah. So. To what degree is it a scientist's responsibility to ensure that their results don't get misrepresented by the media?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously they would say, well, it's not my job. But I think it's wrong. I mean, again, I think when scientists feel like somebody has distorted their work, especially in a high-profile publication, they're crazy not to make a noise about it. I mean, I had a friend who felt that the New York Times had mischaracterized something she said, and she really went after them. Now, cat's out of the bag. They wrote the article. That it's up forever. You're done on that one most of the time. But it's like arguing a call in baseball. I mean, you might not get the umpire to change the call, but the next time they'll be armed with more information. I know it's it's a lot of work and it's a pain in the neck, but I think it's really important to try to correct misinformation than to simply complain about it. Yeah, so yeah, I don't think I mean, I wouldn't say explicitly, oh, it's your responsibility, but I think it's a responsibility that that scientists should adopt more of, and I don't think they realize a lot of the time that the journalists aren't trying to get it wrong. I mean, the trouble is, and this is where it comes down. I mean, look, I'll tell you a little bit of ancient history. I used to interview a guy named Robert Gallo, who was is a scientist, and a good one, who had a lot to do with the early days of trying to identify the virus that causes AIDS. And I also interviewed others like Luc Montagnier, who was another scientist who was trying to identify the virus that causes AIDS. And if I were to show my story about HIV, research to Robert Gallo at one point, he would say, "This is all crap," if I didn't say everything about, how great he was and how terrific his work was and things like that. And so, it does make you reluctant, because in the end, a lot of people didn't feel that he was right about all the things he was claiming to be right about. So scientists, yes, if you measured the pH at 3.2 and I say the pH was 4.2, that's bad and you shouldn't get that wrong. But if I say, the importance of the research is minimal and you think it's maximal, well, we can't have an argument about that. That's your opinion versus my opinion. Now, you may argue, well, my opinion is better informed because I'm a scientist and I do the work. But I would argue that I talk to people more broadly, and people who may have different points of view. So I don't know. It's a problem. I mean, I guess factually, I don't really have a problem. There's a big question in science journalism about whether it's appropriate to share an article with a scientist before it's published. And I mean, I know the true adherents to the journalistic code say never. I'm not in that mode. I don't really mind, because basically if someone says this is all wrong, I want to know about it. If they say it's all wrong because you didn't appreciate how important my work is, I'm just going to ignore it, because that's a judgment call. And yeah, everybody, I mean, everybody thinks his or her work is the most important. Maybe, I don't know, but that's the reason you don't. The people who argue about these things usually are people who are feeling like they didn't realize how great my stuff was and it deserved more attention, or it should have been played higher up. Or another one, which is you left out these important details. Well, let's think about this for a second. The piece I'm going to do this evening on All Things Considered about this sweat patch is 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Now, what detail, if you don't think I'm going to have to leave some details out, then you're not really thinking. So the question is, did I leave out a detail that's so critical that it, without it, the story falls apart? Well, I suppose I've done that on occasion, but mostly I haven't, because I still have a job. I think people get fired if they start reporting on stuff that is generally considered to be misleading or not responsible.
You would hope so. This gets a little bit to the question that Sarah is asking. I was thinking too, are there places where scientists can find resources about these sort of journalistic rules? Because they sort of come in and out, but I think especially these days, there isn't as much adherence to sort of the strictures of, if you went to journalism school, here are the things that you need to know.
Yeah. My son is about to go to journalism school, so I'm hoping he's going to fill me in, because I didn't go. Um, um, I don't really think there is a manual that I could point you to. I'm trying to remember. There's, oh yeah, something called Open Notebook, which has a lot of really helpful professional advice. And I probably should know better if there were such a thing, but um, I don't actually know a place to go. And it's tricky because even if there is, I mean, there are certain things that you learn um, the hard way. For example, and this one it always blows my mind that this is the case, but no, it's not written down anywhere. Maybe it is. Oh, you know where actually there is something. I have an idea. NPR puts online a standards and practices ethics manual. And so if you read through that, it will tell you at least the guidelines that NPR employs for the ethical conduct of journalism writ large. And I bet that would answer a lot of people's questions about what's permitted and what's not permitted. I mean, in the end, a lot of the things that could get you in trouble are resolved by disclosure. So, what I mean is, if you went to visit, for example, this guy I'm interviewing tonight, and it's always in my mind. He's pretty explicit about the patch that he's working on with Gatorade because they're all interested in restoring, sweat and electrolytes that you lose, and if you can put on a patch, it'll tell you how much Gatorade to drink. If you say that up front, that he's working with Gatorade, then people who will say, oh, he's just, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's just trying to sell a product to Gatorade. Oh, well, if that's their genuine bias, then at least they have that knowledge. I don't think that's the case. I don't talk to people. I wouldn't have talked to him if I didn't think he was credible, but at the same time, I think it's valuable to know that he's working on a commercial venture. So that's it.
Are there any folks who are currently in the Scicommers group on the line who would like to share their experiences? And you can unmute yourself at this point if you are.
I just, if somebody does, that's fine. But I noticed, I mean, I'm looking at the questions that you are, since I'm looking at the chat screen, and I noticed that that Kelsey had a sort of like a question about career change, and I was going to say, if you want, I can understand why this might not be the proper venue, but send me a note afterwards, Joe Palca, JPALCA at npr.org, and I'll try to answer your question.
Great. I guess we don't have anybody who's wanting to speak up. Yeah. All right, well, I will put out a last call for questions or comments for Joe. And if there aren't any, we can wrap up earlier than expected.
Well, that's all right. I'm hungry.
Yeah, I mean, everybody on the East Coast is ready for lunch, I'm sure. Okay. Cool. Well, if not, then Joe, thank you for doing this. We will have the video of this posted on YouTube. I've got a playlist of all the various SciEngage discussions that we've had, so you can check that out. If anybody's interested, as always, in suggesting a topic for us to do in upcoming months, we're all ears. These are just things that we sort of come up with out of the blue. Alana and I are sort of emailing back and forth ideas. So open to anyone. And thanks again, Joe. Now, NPR Scicommers, like Joe said, you can join the Slack channels. You can find them on Facebook, on Twitter, and I think the more people who are involved, the better, especially from different levels of science. I think they can really contribute. So
Excellent.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. We'll see you next time.
Okay, take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.